They say a woman's worth is measured by her silence, her beauty, and the fortune she brings to a man's name. They never ask what she thinks of that arrangement. And in the winter of 1873, in a drawing room that smelled of brandy and old money, 26 noblemen sat in velvet chairs and waited to bid on a woman who had no idea she was being sold. Her name was Elara Ashwood, daughter of Viscount Ashwood of Berkshire, educated, sharp-tongued, and possessed of a dignity so fierce that even her maids walked quietly around it. She had spent her entire life believing her father loved her. She was about to learn what he truly loved. The evening it happened, Elara was in the library. She had been reading Keats, a habit her governess had long tried to break, and her father had quietly encouraged, because it kept her occupied and out of his affairs. She liked the library at night, when the candles made gold pools on the wooden floor, and the house was quiet enough that she could hear herself think. She was on her second chapter when she heard the carriages. Not one, not two. A procession of them rolling up the gravel drive in the dark, lanterns swinging like slow pendulums. She went to the window and counted 6, 7, 8, all black, all fine, none of them bearing a crest she recognized at first glance. Her brow furrowed. Her father had said nothing about guests tonight. She set her book down and moved toward the corridor. The voices were low, purposeful, male. She pressed herself against the wall outside the east parlor, the one her father used for private meetings, the one with the thick velvet curtains and the lock on the inside of the door, and she listened. She almost wished she hadn't. "The terms are straightforward," she heard her father say. His voice was smooth and practiced, the voice he used with creditors and clergymen. "One evening, a private arrangement. The gentleman who bids highest takes the lady's hand in a formal engagement to be announced within a fortnight." A murmur of approval. "Age?" someone asked. 26, unblemished reputation, educated, obedient." A pause. "Mostly." Laughter. Elara's blood went cold. "And the lady herself?" Another voice, rough, slow, like gravel dragged across stone. "Has she been informed?" "She will be informed when it is settled," her father said smoothly. "It serves no purpose to involve her prematurely. Women of her temperament require managing, not consulting." More laughter. She stood frozen in the hallway for 5 full seconds. Then she walked, not ran. Because Elara Ashwood did not run from things, she walked straight into them. She walked to the east parlor door, turned the handle, and pushed it open. 26 men looked at her. Her father went the color of old chalk. The room was arranged like a theater. Chairs in rows, a fire blazing at the far end, decanters of port on a sideboard. And at the front, beside a mahogany writing desk with papers on it, her father, standing, with a ledger in his hand. She recognized some of the men. Lord Pethwick, who had 3 deceased wives and a reputation that preceded him into every room. Baron Strain, who was 62 and had once patted her hand at a dinner party in a way that made her skin crawl. There were others she didn't know. Young men with hungry eyes. Old men with patient ones. All of them watching her with a specific, measuring quality that she had never been on the receiving end of, and that she understood, with terrible clarity, in an instant. She was not a guest here. She was the item on offer. "Elara," her father said carefully, "go upstairs." She looked at him for a long moment. In that moment, every memory she had of him rearranged itself. Every time he had smiled at her across the dinner table. Every time he had called her his dearest girl. Every letter he had written from London. Every book he had slipped under her door. Every small tenderness she had stored in her heart like pressed flowers, she felt them all turn to dust. "No," she said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Her father straightened. "Elara." "You are going to sell me," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was distantly proud of that. To one of these men, without telling me, without asking me. She looked around the room slowly. Like livestock. Not a single man spoke. Then, from the back of the room, a figure rose. He had been sitting apart from the others. She hadn't noticed him immediately, which was strange, because he was not the kind of man one overlooked. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark. His face was all sharp angles and contained expression, the kind of face that gave nothing away. He wore black, which made him look carved from shadow rather than dressed in it. His eyes, when they found hers across the room, were gray, cold as December river water. He said nothing. He simply stood. And then he looked at her father with an expression that was almost bored and said, "Name your price, Ashwood, the full amount, tonight, and we end this." Her father blinked. "Your Grace." "The full amount," the man repeated, and his voice was the kind that didn't raise itself because it didn't need to. "Your debts to Harwick, your outstanding note to the bank, the mortgage on the Berkshire estate. Name the number." A silence fell over the room that had a different quality from before. "That is," her father swallowed, "that is a considerable sum, Your Grace." "I am aware of arithmetic, Ashwood." The dark-eyed man glanced at the other men in the room with the mild contempt of someone surveying furniture they decided not to purchase. "And I suspect several gentlemen present are not here for the lady's hand so much as the prospect of leveraging her father's desperation into an advantageous match." His gray eyes returned to her father. "I am offering to spare everyone in this room a great deal of unpleasantness, except—" The room was completely silent. Elara looked at the man who had just purchased her. He had not looked at her since that first moment. He was looking at her father as though she were not present at all. She was not grateful. She was not relieved. She was furious. His name was Callum Devereux, Duke of Ashenmoor. His reputation arrived in rooms before he did, which was something he had long since stopped trying to prevent. Cold, they called him, ruthless, the Iron Duke, a man who had run 3 business competitors into bankruptcy without visible remorse, and who attended society events with the enthusiasm of a man attending his own autopsy. He was 34. He had been briefly engaged 8 years ago to Lady Cecily Montrose, an arrangement that had ended in a scandal that neither party discussed in public, and which had left him, by all accounts, entirely disinterested in matrimony. He did not want a wife. He had not come to Lord Ashwood's disgraceful little gathering with any intention of bidding. He had come because he had been informed of what Ashwood was planning through channels that were none of Ashwood's business, and because the list of men attending had included Lord Harwick Beaumont. And Callum Devereux did not permit Lord Harwick Beaumont to acquire anything he wanted, not after what Beaumont had done 7 years ago. He had not expected her. He had expected a frightened girl, something fragile and biddable that Beaumont would enjoy breaking. What walked through that door instead was a woman with iron in her spine and fire in her eyes, who looked at her own father with such precise, devastating disappointment that Callum had felt some long dormant thing stir uncomfortably in his chest. He had not planned to bid. He bid anyway. The next morning he sat across from Viscount Ashwood in a solicitor's office in Mayfair and wrote a bank draft that wiped the man's debts clean. In exchange, he received the formal documentation of betrothal and the bewildered, stammering gratitude of a man who knew he had been bailed out, but wasn't entirely certain why. "My daughter," Ashwood said carefully, "may require some gentle persuasion regarding the arrangement." Callum looked at him. "She has spirit," Ashwood added, as though this were an apology. "I noticed," Callum said, and went home. Elara spent the night in her room. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the dark, and did what she had always done. With unbearable things she organized them into order. She examined them from every angle, and she decided what she was going to do. She was not going to weep. She was not going to accept this. She was going to fight it, every inch of it. In the morning she went downstairs and found her father at breakfast, looking sheepish and relieved. In equal measure, the expression of a man who has done something terrible and been saved from its consequences. She sat down across from him. She poured her tea. She waited until the maid had left. Then she said, "I will not marry him." Her father set down his fork. "Elara." "I will not marry him," she repeated. "I don't care how much money he paid. I don't care about the debts. I am not a transaction. I am your daughter." "You are my daughter," her father agreed quietly, "which is why you must do this." "Must." She looked at him. "Tell me, father, when did I become something you could trade?" "Elara, if the estate falls, then let it fall." She was on her feet before she decided to stand. "Let the creditors take the silver and the paintings and every stick of furniture in this house. What does it matter? What does any of it matter compared to—" She stopped. Her throat was tight. She would not cry in front of him. She would not give him that. "I would have helped you. If you had told me. I would have found a way. I had 3 suitors last season alone, men of good standing, men who wanted to know me before they wanted to own me, if you had only asked me." "None of them had Ashenmoor's money," her father said. The bluntness of it silenced her. She looked at him across the breakfast table. This man she had loved her whole life. This man who had taught her to ride and read her poetry aloud and called her his cleverest girl, and she felt the last warm thing she'd been carrying toward him go cold and still. "I see," she said. She went upstairs. She packed a bag. She got as far as the front gate before the Duke of Ashenmoor's carriage pulled up beside her. The window came down. He looked at her bag, then at her face, then at the road ahead of her. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Away," she said. "You have no money," he said. "Your father's accounts are frozen until the estate transfers. Your aunt in Bath doesn't know you're coming, and it's December." She stared at him. "I had your situation reviewed this morning," he said, without apparent embarrassment. "Get in the carriage, Miss Ashwood." "I will not." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his gray eyes. Not quite impatience, not quite something else. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. "You already have," she said. "You just haven't noticed." He was quiet. Then he said, "Get in the carriage. I will explain." "I don't want your explanations." "Nevertheless," he said, "you are going to hear them, and then you may make whatever decision you choose." It was not a command exactly. It was something more measured than that. She studied him through the window, this cold, unreadable man who had bought her like a horse at market and now sat in his carriage as though the whole affair were simply a matter of logistics to be sorted. She got in the carriage, not because she trusted him, because she was cold, and she had nowhere to go, and something about the careful flatness of his voice made her believe against her better judgment that he was telling the truth about at least one thing. He wasn't going to hurt her. Not yet. They sat across from each other in the carriage with a foot of space between them and enough silence to fill a cathedral. He did not look at her at first. He looked at the window, at the gray London morning rolling past. Then he said, without preamble, "Lord Harwick Beaumont was in that room." "I know who he is," she said. "Then you know his reputation." She did. Everyone in society knew of Beaumont. Viscount Beaumont of Falstone, 47, rich in land and poor in conscience. He had been married twice. His first wife had died of fever. His second wife had the official story was a carriage accident. The unofficial story, whispered at the back of ballrooms in voices that fell to silence when a butler appeared, was something else altogether. She said nothing. He wanted you specifically, Callum said. Not as a matter of attraction. Beaumont collects women the way other men collect maps or silver. It's about acquisition, about control. He paused. Your father was going to accept his bid. The other men were largely there for the sport of it. Beaumont was there for you. The carriage swayed. That doesn't explain why you intervened, she said. No, he agreed. Then explain it. He turned to look at her then. Full on. The gray eyes were not warm, but they were direct, and she realized something about him that she hadn't at first. This was not a man who avoided things. This was a man who looked at them steadily and then decided what to do. I know what Beaumont is, he said. I have known for 7 years. I have not been able to prove it publicly, but I have made it my business to prevent him from acquiring power wherever I can. A pause. You were in his line of sight. I removed you from it. By buying me. By paying your father's debts in exchange for a legal betrothal. Yes. And what do you want in return? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, a wife who doesn't interfere in my affairs and a household that runs without scandal. That's all. She looked at him. You don't want a wife, she said. No, he said. Then why? I told you why. She sat with that for a long moment. The carriage moved. Outside, London became the outskirts of London, became the country road north. Where are we going? She asked. Ashenmoor, he said. My estate in Northumberland. We will be married there, quietly, before the new year. And if I refuse? Then I return you to your father's house. Your father defaults on his debts within the week. The estate is seized, and you find yourself a ward of an uncle in Scotland who, I understand, has opinions about women reading books. He said it without cruelty, merely as fact. I am not presenting you with a good choice, Miss Ashwood. I am presenting you with the least terrible one. She stared at him. You are the most arrogant man I have ever met, she said. Something shifted in his expression so briefly she almost missed it. Not quite amusement, just a single degree of loosening around the eyes. Probably, he said, and then he looked back out the window and said nothing more. The estate appeared from the mist like something conjured from a dream. It sat on a ridge in Northumberland, gray stone and Georgian columns, with the moors behind it, and a dark lake at its foot, and windows that caught the winter light like still water. It was larger than her father's estate, larger than most of the great houses she had visited, and it had an atmosphere she couldn't quite name, not forbidding, exactly, but contained, like a man who had learned to hold everything inside. The staff assembled in the entrance hall to receive them. A housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with a manner that suggested she had seen everything this house could produce and was unimpressed by none of it. A butler named Hartley, a young maid with red hair and an expression of undisguised curiosity, who Elara learned was called Bess. Your room is prepared, miss, Mrs. Poole said, studying Elara with the careful assessment of someone cataloging damage. Thank you, Elara said. Later, Bess showed her to a bedroom that was larger than her entire wing, at home blue silk curtains, a fire already lit, a writing desk by the window that looked out over the moors. She stood in the middle of it and tried to take stock. She was in a strange house in the north of England. She was to be married against her will to a man who had described wanting her company with all the warmth of a property survey. She had no allies, no resources, no plan. She sat down at the writing desk and began making one. Downstairs, Callum stood in his study and looked at the fire. Hartley appeared in the doorway with the discretion of a man who had served this family for 30 years and knew when his employer needed to be alone. "Lady Cecily Montrose has called twice this week," Hartley said. "She is asking when you will be in London." "Write her that my schedule is indeterminate," Callum said. "Very good, Your Grace." A pause. "She will have heard by now," Callum said. "The betrothal will be in the papers by Thursday." "Quite likely," Hartley said neutrally. Callum was quiet for a moment. 7 years ago, he had been a different man. Younger. Not exactly warmer, but less deliberately cold. The coldness had come later, after Cecily, after what he had learned about trust and the particular cruelty of beautiful people who knew their beauty was a currency. He had closed himself down after that the way a house is shuttered for winter. Systematically, room by room. He had not expected, in that room at Ashwood's estate, to feel something unlock. It was nothing romantic. He was clear about that. She was a stranger. She was angry with him, justifiably. She was trapped, and she knew it, and she was choosing to be present anyway. Which was not gratitude, it was survival, and he respected that. And that was all. That was all. "Tell Mrs. Poole to have the west wing opened," he said. "Miss Ashwood may use the library." He had noted she'd been reading when the carriages arrived. He had noted the book left open on the window seat. It was a small thing. He told himself it was simply good management of household resources. They settled into a strange, careful coexistence. He was in the estate for the morning, gone to his accounts or his tenants or his various business affairs for the afternoon, and appeared at dinner precisely at 8. He was always dressed, always composed. He asked her polite, impersonal questions whether her room was comfortable, whether she had everything she needed with the attentiveness of a good host, rather than the warmth of a man who cared about the answers. She answered them in kind, politely, coldly. She explored the library. It was extraordinary floor to ceiling, 3 ladders on rails, a fireplace with 2 leather chairs, and an organization system that she slowly realized was entirely thematic rather than alphabetical, organized by the emotional register of the texts. Philosophy beside poetry, history beside biography. The novels arranged not by author, but by mood, by what they did to the reader. Someone had made this library with great care and deep feeling. She looked around the room with new eyes. She found him there on the 5th day. He was reading by the fire. When she came in, she hadn't expected him, and she stopped in the doorway. He looked up. Neither of them moved for a moment. "I'll go," she said. "You don't have to," he said. She came in. She took the chair across from his. She took her book. They sat in silence for 2 hours. It was the least terrible 2 hours she had spent at Ashenmoor. The following evening at dinner, she said, "You organized the library yourself." He looked at her across the table. "The system," she said. "It's not conventional, but it makes sense if you think about books as experiences rather than objects." A pause. "My mother's system," he said. "I didn't change it after she died." She hadn't expected that. The slight softening in his voice, the careful way he said died rather than passing or loss. "When did she die?" she asked. "I was 12, he said. She let it sit. Then, "Mine died when I was 9. He looked at her for a moment. "That's young," he said. "Yes," she agreed. The dinner continued. The silence between them was the same as it had always been, but it had changed its quality. It was no longer empty. It was, she thought, the silence of 2 people who have recognized each other as something other than adversaries, without quite deciding what to do about it. She arrived on a Thursday. Elara was in the front garden, or trying to be, wrapped in her heaviest coat and attempting to sketch the moors, which was more difficult than she'd anticipated when the carriage came up the drive. An elegant thing, burgundy lacquered, with a coat of arms she didn't recognize. The woman who stepped out of it was breathtaking. Black hair, pale skin, a figure that moved like water, unhurried and impossible to look away from. She was perhaps 30, perhaps less. She looked at Elara with an expression of polite curiosity that had the architecture of a weapon. "You must be Miss Ashwood," she said. Her voice was musical and perfectly controlled. "I'm Cecily Montrose. Callum and I are very old friends." There was something in the way she said old friends, a slight elevation of emphasis, a softness around the word that was intended to convey a great deal without saying anything that could be objected to directly. Elara recognized the technique. She had seen it deployed at a dozen dinner parties. "Lady Montrose," she said pleasantly, "what a journey from London. You must be exhausted." "Not at all," Cecily said and smiled. She stayed for 3 days. During those 3 days, she was never less than gracious to Elara, to the staff, to Callum. She was witty and elegant and adept at the particular art of making another woman feel invisible without doing anything that could be pointed to. She touched Callum's arm when she spoke to him. She referenced dinners and evenings they'd shared in a warm, offhand way, as though Elara's presence were simply a curious development rather than a fundamental change in the landscape. Callum was polite to her, distant in the way he was distant with everyone. But Elara watched his face when Cecily spoke, and she saw something not warmth, exactly, but the controlled absence of something that had once been there. Like a room from which furniture has been removed. You could see the outlines of where things had stood. She didn't ask him about it. She didn't know why she wanted to. On the second night after dinner, she went to the library. She had been sitting by the fire for perhaps 20 minutes when Cecily appeared in the doorway. "May I?" she said. "Of course," Elara said. Cecily sat, and for a moment they were quiet. Then she said pleasantly, "He'll never love you, you know." Elara looked at her. "I'm not saying it to be cruel," Cecily continued, with the self-possession of someone who absolutely was. "I simply think it's kinder for you to understand the situation clearly. Callum is well. He loved me once. He was quite passionate about it, actually. And I wasn't kind to him. I was young and foolish, and I chose someone else. And by the time I understood what I'd lost, he had simply finished feeling things." She tilted her head. "I've tried to get back there, to that place in him. But there's a door that's closed now, and I don't have the key anymore." "Why are you telling me this?" Elara asked. "Because you're looking at him," Cecily said, "the way I used to." A silence. "I am not looking at him in any way," Elara said. Cecily smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It did not reach her eyes. "No," she said. "Of course not." She rose. "I'll say good night." She left. Elara sat very still, looking at the fire. She was not, she told herself, looking at him in any way. She was a woman in an arranged marriage who had not consented to any of this, and was merely attempting to survive the situation with her dignity intact. She was not looking at anyone. She was not. Cecily left on Friday morning. That evening, a storm came in from the north, the kind that Northumberland specializes in, low and purple and absolute, with wind that threw itself against the windows and rain that came sideways. By 9 o'clock, the power to the gas lamps in the east wing had failed, and Bess appeared at Elara's door with a candlestick and an apologetic expression. "His Grace asks if you'd be comfortable in the drawing-room until the lamps are fixed, miss," she said. "There's a proper fire in there." The drawing-room, where Callum was. She went. He was standing at the window watching the storm, glass of whiskey in hand. He turned when she came in. Something brief moved across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at how she looked by candlelight, though that was probably her imagination. "Sit down," he said. "It'll be an hour at least." She sat. He sat across from her, and they watched the fire. "Does the estate flood?" she asked. "The lower field does," he said. "The house is sound." A crack of thunder that shook the glass. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked. "No," she said. Then, because honesty felt appropriate somehow, in the dark with the weather trying to take the roof, "I was when I was small. My mother used to bring me to a room." A pause. "We'd sit exactly like this by the fire. She'd read to me until it passed." He was quiet. "What did she read?" he asked. She looked at him. It was such a small, specific question. Not polite, not performative. He actually wanted to know. "Shakespeare," she said. "The comedies." She said tragedies were for daylight, when you could see them clearly. Comedies were for storms. He almost smiled. Not quite. But the corner of his mouth moved in a way she hadn't seen before, and it changed his face. It made it possible, briefly, to see the man underneath the architecture of control. "She sounds like someone I'd have liked," he said. "She was," Elara said. They sat together for a long time after that, longer than an hour, longer than the lamps would have needed. The storm blew itself out, and the house went quiet, and they kept sitting, talking in quiet, careful exchanges about nothing consequential and somehow everything important. Books, childhood houses, the particular grief of growing up without a mother, the way that grief never goes away, but learns eventually to take up less space. She did not realize until she was back in her room, lying in the dark, how much of herself she had given away in that drawing room. And she did not realize, until she had been lying awake for an hour, how much of himself he had given in return. She thought about what Cecily had said. "There's a door that's closed now, and I don't have the key anymore." She stared at the ceiling. She thought about the library, organized by her dead mother's system, unchanged for 22 years. She thought about the way he had said died instead of passing. She thought very distinctly and against her own better judgment. Someone has a key. He's just not sure he trusts them with it yet. Then she stopped thinking and told herself to go to sleep. The letter arrived on a Monday. She knew something was wrong when she saw Callum's face at breakfast. He read the letter once, folded it, and set it down beside his coffee cup, with the careful precision of a man preventing himself from crumpling it. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her. Then he handed her the letter. It was from Beaumont. It was elegantly written, formally polite. And underneath the veneer of courtesy was the clear, cold threat of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and had decided to demonstrate, before the wedding could be finalized, exactly how much leverage he still had. He had information, he wrote, about the Duke of Ashenmoor's past, about the nature of his broken engagement to Lady Montrose, about what had truly happened 7 years ago, and what it would do to the Duke's standing and to any woman foolish enough to attach herself to his name if that information became known. He was not demanding anything, he wrote. He merely thought the lady deserved to know. Elara read it twice. Then she set it down. "What happened 7 years ago?" she asked. Callum looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing that should shame me," he said. "And everything that does anyway." She waited. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to speak. Then he said, "Cecily and I were engaged when I was 27. I was in love with her. I was in the way of young men who have been solitary too long and mistake intensity of feeling for wisdom, completely devoted to her." A pause. "She was not devoted to me. She was conducting an affair with Lord Harwick Beaumont throughout our engagement. I didn't know until the week before our wedding, when I found letters. Elara said nothing. I broke the engagement, he said. Privately. No announcement, no public scene. I told her I knew, and I gave her the choice to leave quietly. She did. He turned to look at her. Beaumont found out that I had discovered them and chose silence rather than scandal. He has always taken that as a personal defeat. A man like Beaumont needs his power clearly understood, and the fact that I knew and did nothing, said nothing, has bothered him for 7 years. So this letter, Elara said, is an attempt to poison you against me before the wedding makes his access to you legally impossible. He said it simply, without drama. Once we are married, he cannot leverage the scandal of a broken engagement. But until then, what does he want? She asked. To destroy this marriage before it happens, Callum said, and if possible, to leave you without options and available to him. She was quiet for a moment. He's not going to succeed, she said. Callum looked at her. I don't know you well, she said carefully. You have not been warm or easy or anything I would have chosen for myself. But you have not lied to me. You have not hurt me. You told me the truth about that room and why you were in it, and I believe you. She picked up the letter and handed it back to him. Burn it, and let's get married before he can write another one. Something happened in his face then. Something opened. It was brief, a handful of seconds, in which the architecture of control that he wore like armor shifted, and she could see something behind it. Something that had been there a long time. Something that looked, from the outside, very much like a man realizing he had been wrong about something important. Then it closed again, but not all the way. The rector can come Friday, he said. Friday then, she said. They were married on a Friday morning in the small chapel on the Ashenmoor estate, with Mrs. Poole and Hartley and Bess as witnesses, and the winter light coming through the stained glass, and making everything gold and blue. She wore dark green, her nicest dress, brought from home, because she refused to wear white for a wedding that hadn't asked her permission. He wore charcoal and said nothing about the green. His eyes, when she walked to the front of the chapel, did something she was beginning to recognize, that slight contained shift that meant he was affected, but had decided not to show it. The rector was old and kind, and rushed through the ceremony with the focused energy of a man who understood that brevity was a mercy. At the end, Callum put a ring on her finger. It was not the family ring she'd learned later that he'd had a different one made, quietly, in the weeks since the betrothal. It was a single diamond in an emerald setting, old-fashioned in style, elegant in proportion. She looked at it on her hand. She thought, he noticed I wore green. She thought, stop it. You may kiss the bride, the rector said. Callum looked at her. You don't have to, she said under her breath. I know, he said. And then he leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek, not quite her mouth, not quite a stranger's distance either, but somewhere in between, somewhere warm and careful and deliberately chosen, and she felt it all the way down her spine. Congratulations, Your Grace, Mrs. Poole said, and her eyes were bright. Elara was fairly sure that Mrs. Poole had already decided how this story ended. She was not certain Mrs. Poole was wrong. They did not speak about the kiss. They did not speak about the storm evening either, or the library hours, or any of the small, intimate things that had accumulated between them like snow slowly, quietly, until suddenly the ground was covered and you couldn't remember when the first flake had fallen. They were married now. That was new ground. She moved into the Duchess's suite, adjacent to his rooms, and he knocked on the connecting door on the first evening and said, through the door, I want you to know that you may lock this door, and I will not interfere. This house is yours. The staff is at your disposal. Whatever else this marriage is or isn't, this is your home." She stood on her side of the door and looked at it. Then she said, "Thank you." A pause. His footsteps moving away. She did not lock the door. She did not quite know what to make of that decision, so she went to sleep and refused to think about it. The days settled into a different rhythm now. She was the Duchess of Ashenmoor, which meant that the estate ran partly through her. She met with Mrs. Poole in the mornings. She received the tenants' wives. She managed the household accounts with the focused attention she'd always brought to problems she was allowed to engage with, and she was good at it, which she found both gratifying and faintly irritating, because she hadn't consented to this life, and she didn't think she should enjoy it. But she enjoyed it. She enjoyed the library. She enjoyed the moors on clear days, the particular fierce beauty of the landscape that was nothing like Berkshire's gentle green, but had a quality of absolute honesty that she found, gradually, restful. You couldn't pretend in a landscape that open. It was too large for pretending. She enjoyed, if she was honest, the evenings, because Callum was different here in his own estate, in his own house, than she'd expected. Not warm exactly, still. He was never going to be warm in the easy way of men who move through the world without scars. But he was present. He listened when she spoke. He asked questions that surprised her with their precision, their genuine interest. He did not condescend. He did not manage her. One evening she was arguing with him about land management. She'd read his accounts and had opinions about the drainage on the North Field that she presented over dinner with what she privately acknowledged was considerable aggression, and instead of dismissing her or tolerating her with the polished indifference she'd expected, he sat back in his chair and said, "Go on." She blinked. "You have a point about the North Field," he said. "I've been resistant to the investment because of the upfront cost. But you're right that the long-term yield justifies it. What would you propose?" She stared at him. Then she proposed it. He agreed to half of it immediately and debated the rest with her for 40 minutes with the engaged, respectful attention of a man who had decided the person across the table was worth listening to. Not because she was his wife, because she was right. She went to bed that night feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy exactly. Something more cautious than that. Something like possible. It was Bess who told her, not deliberately. Bess was young and loyal and had the kind of open face that made her a poor keeper of secrets. And she had clearly adored the Duke since she'd come to the estate at 16, and he'd learned her name and used it rather than simply calling her girl. They were in the Duchess's sitting room, Elara writing letters, Bess mending curtain ties, and Bess said without looking up, "He used to not sleep at all, you know, after the Lady Cecily business. Mrs. Poole used to find him in the library at 4 a.m. for a year after it happened." Elara set down her pen. "Bess." "Sorry, Miss Your Grace. I shouldn't have." "No," Elara said. "Tell me," Bess told her. Not just about Cecily, though that was part of it, the way a man hollows out when the person he chose has used his heart as a convenience and discarded it without apparent cost. But about the other thing, the thing that Beaumont's letter had referenced in its slithery, oblique way. When Callum had broken the engagement, Cecily had told people her own version. Not the truth. A story that he had been cold, that he had been cruel, that there had been behavior that no lady should be subjected to. Nothing specific enough to be disproved, nothing that could be taken to court, just enough to ensure that the sympathy in most drawing rooms sat with her. He had not defended himself. He had not tried to explain. He had simply taken it. She had married Lord Vance within 6 months. They'd been notably happy for a year before Vance died, leaving her wealthy and available, at which point her ongoing proximity to Beaumont had taken on a more legible shape. She had tried to re-enter Callum's orbit in the years since. He had been politely impenetrable. "He doesn't talk about it," Bess said. "He never did. He got quiet. He's always been quiet. But he got a different kind of quiet after, if that makes sense." Elara thought about the library, the way he'd said died, the way he looked at her across dinner when he thought she wasn't watching, or perhaps knowing that she was, and looking anyway. "It makes sense," she said. She found him in the stables that afternoon. He was checking on one of the horses a large, ancient gray named Parliamentarian, who was, according to Hartley, the only living creature in England that the Duke unguardedly liked. She stood at the stable door and said, "Cecily told people that you were cruel to her." He went very still. "I know you weren't," she said. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm telling you that I know." He turned to look at her. "You didn't have to defend yourself," she said. "But you should have been able to. It should have been possible for you to say what actually happened and be believed." She paused. "I'm angry on your behalf." He looked at her for a long moment. "No one has ever been angry on my behalf," he said. It was so simple, so direct, like something that had escaped him without permission. She walked into the stable. She stood beside Parliamentarian and put her hand on the horse's gray nose, because it gave her something to look at that wasn't his face. "Well," she said, "get used to it." She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, but in the family of one, something that released. "Elara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without her title. She kept her eyes on the horse. "Yes?" she said. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She went back to the house. She sat in the library for an hour and stared at the fire and told herself very firmly that she was not falling in love with Callum Devereux, Duke of Ashenmoor. She was somewhat credible on this point for approximately 3 more days. The threat, when it came through her father. She received a letter, her father's handwriting, shaking and unlike itself. He had come to London. He had been contacted by Beaumont, who had offered him another sum enough to buy his silence about what had actually happened at the auction, except silenced in the other direction. His testimony that Elara had attended the auction voluntarily, had been a willing participant, which would make her marriage to Callum appear to be a sham, a scheme, an arrangement that could be challenged legally. It was a tangled, ugly piece of manipulation. And her father, she read between the shaking lines of his letter, was considering it. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went to Callum. He read it in his study, standing by the window, and she watched his face go through several things. Anger, yes, but also something that looked, briefly, like the specific pain of a man who has tried not to expect betrayal and has been betrayed anyway. "He's going to do it," she said. "My father. He's going to take Beaumont's money." "Probably," Callum said. "What do we do?" He set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment, thinking she'd learned, not withdrawing. The quality of the silence was different. "We go to London," he said. "We attend the Pemberton Ball Friday. Together, publicly. Every gossip in society will be present. You will be seen as the Duchess of Ashenmoor, entirely at ease, entirely by choice. Whatever story Beaumont tries to construct after that will be arguing with the direct visual evidence of 100 eyewitnesses." She thought about it. "And my father?" A pause. "I'll speak to your father." "Callum." It was the first time she'd used his name. She saw him register it, the slight shift, the intake of breath. "What will you say to him?" He looked at her directly. "I'll tell him the truth," he said. "That his daughter is worth more than Beaumont's money, that the life she has now is one she has earned, and that if he does this, He will lose her entirely, not because I'll take her from him, but because she will choose to walk away, and she will be right." She stared at him. "Will she?" he asked, quietly, carefully. It was a different question than it appeared to be on the surface. She understood that. She said, "Probably," and then, "Yes." The word meant more than one thing. She intended it to mean more than one thing. She watched him understand that, and watched the thing behind his gray eyes open a little further. "Right," he said. "London on Thursday." The ball was everything Victorian society could be, at its most magnificent and most predatory chandeliers blazing over 300 people, who were smiling with their mouths and measuring with their eyes, silk dresses and tailored coats, and the particular electric atmosphere of a room that has heard a rumor and is waiting to see it confirmed or denied. The rumor in this case was them. They entered together. She was in deep blue, a gown that Mrs. Poole had arranged for her with suspicious speed and excellent taste, that made her look like something from a painting. He was in black. His hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, not possessive, simply present, steady, a point of contact that said, "I am here. I have chosen to stand here." The room turned. They moved through it together. He introduced her to people not as an afterthought, not with the faint embarrassment of a man saddled with an inconvenient wife, but with a precise, quiet pride that she felt in her chest every time he said, "My wife, the Duchess of Ashenmoor." He stayed beside her. He watched the room with those gray eyes, and when Lord Beaumont appeared at the edge of the gathering, moving toward them with the smooth confidence of a man who expected things to go his way, Callum turned to face him directly. They stood 20 feet apart. The room, those nearest, the ones who mattered, who would carry this to every parlor in England, held its breath. Beaumont smiled. Callum looked at him with the expression of a man looking at something that no longer has any leverage. Elara took Callum's arm, not because she was afraid, not because she needed his protection, but because she had chosen to be here. She had chosen this man not easily, not without cost, not without a fight that she wouldn't have traded, and she wanted Beaumont to see it. She wanted every person in that room to see a woman who was where she had decided to be, standing beside a man she had decided to stand beside. Beaumont stopped. He looked at them both. He read, in their posture and proximity, the thing he'd come to prevent. He turned and walked toward the supper room. He did not speak to them. He did not speak to either of them for the rest of the evening. Her father was there. She saw him at the edge of the room, looking older and smaller than she'd ever seen him. He met her eyes across the crowd. He didn't move toward her. She didn't move toward him. But she nodded. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was an acknowledgment that she was still standing, that she had survived what he'd done to her, had walked through the worst of it and come out the other side, into something she hadn't expected. He nodded back. He looked, she thought, more ashamed than she had ever seen another person look. She thought that probably somewhere beneath the weakness and the desperation and the terrible choices, he had loved her. That love had not been enough to protect her, but it was what it was. She turned back to the room. She turned back to Callum. They arrived home at midnight. The house was quiet. The staff had gone to bed. The fire in the entrance hall was banked low, and candles burned on the sideboard, and everything was still. She was taking off her gloves. He was behind her, and he said, "Elara." She turned. He was standing in the hallway, with the kind of expression she'd never seen on his face before, not quite open, not unguarded in the way of people who haven't been hurt, but present in a way that cost him something visible. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I didn't bring you here out of kindness," he said. "I told you I did. I told you it was about Beaumont, and that part was true. But it wasn't the whole truth." She was very still. "When you walked into that room," he said, "you were—" He paused. The words seemed to require more effort than usual. "There are very few people in the world who would do what you did in that moment, who would walk in, look at the situation clearly, and simply refuse it. Not with hysteria, not with collapse, with dignity so complete it was almost frightening." He looked at her steadily. "I had not felt anything in a very long time. I had managed to not feel things quite successfully. And then you were there, and I felt something immediately and entirely against my will. And I bit on your hand, not just to remove you from Beaumont's reach, though I would have done that regardless, but because the thought of you belonging to any other person in that room, in any room, for any reason, was something I was not able to tolerate." She looked at him. "That is," she said carefully, "approximately the least romantic declaration I have ever heard." Something cracked across his face. The almost smile, fully realized now wide, brief, unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on another person. "I know," he said. She crossed the hallway. She put her hands on either side of his face, the sharp jaw, the lines of it, the gray eyes looking at her with more open vulnerability than she had thought he was capable of, and she said, "I did not want to fall in love with you." "I know," he said. "I was furious with you for months. Justifiably. You are cold and arrogant, and you communicated an entire marriage proposal through property law. That is accurate. And I love you," she said. "I love you completely and without qualification, and it's extremely inconvenient, and I have no idea what to do with it." He put his hands over hers on his face, and he held them there. "I love you," he said. Quiet, simple. The voice of a man saying something he has carried for a long time and is only now allowed to put down. "I don't know how to do it well. I've had very little practice. But I intend to be better at it than I've been at everything else." She pressed her forehead to his. "That," she said, "is the most romantic thing you've said." "I'll work on it," he said. And then he kissed her. Spring came to Northumberland the way it always did, slowly, then all at once. The moors went from gray to green. The lake unfroze. Parliamentarian was turned out to pasture and stood in the new grass with the contentment of a very old horse who has outlived everyone's expectations. In the library of Ashenmoor, a new book had appeared on the shelf. Elara had placed it there herself, small volume of Keats, the one she'd been reading on the night everything changed. She'd shelved it beside the Shakespeare comedies in the section of the library organized by a dead woman's instinct and a living man's loyalty, by things that made you feel less alone. Mrs. Poole had begun planning the West Wing for a nursery, with the focused determination of a woman who intends to will things into existence. Bess had been promoted, nominally for her excellent service, and in practice, because the Duchess had taken a shine to her, and the Duke had signed the letter without reading it, which Bess knew and appreciated and would never mention. Lord Beaumont had left England for the continent with a cloud over him that grew thicker with each passing season, as other women found the courage, in the wake of Elara's very public contentment, to say what they had long been afraid to say. It would not happen quickly. Powerful men rarely fell quickly. But the wall around him had developed cracks. Her father visited in April. He arrived with a letter of apology that ran to 11 pages, she counted, and she read it in the garden and then went inside and cried, properly, for the first time since that night in the parlor. She received him in the drawing-room. They drank tea. They did not speak of the auction. They spoke of her mother instead, and of small things, and of what it might look like to begin again in whatever diminished way was possible. It was not healed, but it was not over either. That evening she found Callum in the library. He was reading. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and curled into the chair beside his, which was now understood to be her chair, and she tucked her feet under her and picked up her book, and they read together in the firelight the way they had since the very beginning, when they were two guarded people sitting a polite distance apart, and neither of them had known yet what the distance would become. He reached across without looking up from his book and took her hand. She looked at their hands, joined in the firelight. She thought about a room full of men with hungry eyes, and a woman who had walked into it alone and refused to break. She thought about a man who had sat at the back of that room and felt something against his will, and had chosen to act on it even when he couldn't have told you what it meant. She thought, love is not always a feeling at first. Sometimes it is a choice made in a difficult moment. Sometimes it is a man who pays your debts and asks for nothing and gives you a library. Sometimes it is a woman who refuses to be grateful until there's something worth being grateful for, and then is grateful with her whole heart. She turned a page. He did not let go of her hand. The fire burned. The moors were quiet outside. And the Duchess of Ashenmoor, who had been auctioned and bought and married and loved in spite of everything, smiled at her book in the way of a woman who has found the life she would have chosen had anyone thought to ask her.